Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Every great story begins somewhere, and for today's guest, it began in Texas with a curiosity about words, stories, and the many ways human beings have consumed them across history. That curiosity took Dr. Matthew Rubery on a remarkable journey from a lecture halls to Philadelphia and leads to the corridors of Harvard University, where he earned his doctorate, and finally to Queen Mary University of London, where he has been shaping the field of modern literature and media history since 2010. But what truly sets Dr. Rubery apart is the questions he asks. What happened to fiction when newspapers arrived? What does it mean to listen to a book rather than read it? How have people who read differently, the dyslexics, the visually impaired, the distracted, shaped the very history of reading itself? And what secrets were Victorian journalists willing to risk everything to uncover? These are the just academic questions. They are windows into how we make sense of the world. And Dr. Matthew Rubery has spent his career turning them into books that matter. His four co-authored and authored works, The Novelty of Newspapers, The Untold Story of the Talking Book, Reader's Block, and Undercover span Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, and Cambridge University presses, a testament to the breadth and depth of his scholarship. As an editor, he has further shaped conversations around audiobooks, investigative journalism, and the future of reading itself. It is a true honor to welcome him to Business Talk today. Professor Rubery, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Professor, the book challenges the very definition of reading. In your own words, how would you define reading and how has the definition shifted for you while writing this book?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? There's an old saying among literacy researchers that it seems easier to write an entire book about reading than actually to define it. And that was certainly my experience writing this book, which may sound surprising because, reading is one of the most fundamental activities in the humanities. It seems like it's a pretty essential term that we should all be familiar with. And yet it's one of those terms that the more you think about it, the more complicated it becomes. I think it's because it just seems so obvious for most people that, there's just something we do and there's not that much to explain. But once we look at the range of ways in people do it, I think that's where it becomes more complex. So a key premise of my book is that there is no single activity known as reading. Instead, there are lots of different ways that people do it, even though in casual conversation, we just talk about it as if everyone does it the same way. The examples in my book, then, that I'm drawing together, they are trying to push us to rethink the scope of that term. I look at a lot of exceptional cases or edge cases that really push the boundaries of, does something count? What counts as reading? I'm trying to sort of follow the lead of neuroscientists here who have long insisted that we learn about the brain by paying attention to what happens when something goes wrong with it. So I'm looking at sort of examples of reading where something goes wrong with reading. This is probably easier to imagine through specific examples. So one of the cases that I look at in the book is of a stroke survivor who loses the ability to read in the conventional way with their eyes, but is still able to read using their tongue. They're able to trace letter shapes on the roof of their mouth. So I just want a definition or understanding of reading as a spectrum that is capable of encompassing all these different ways of reading that usually sort of get left out of history. So I want a definition of reading that just includes reading with the tongue.
Professor, you explore a wide range of neurological conditions, dyslexia, hyperlexia, synesthesia, dementia, and more. Was there one condition or personal testimony that genuinely surprised or moved you during your research?
Yeah, I'd say, well, researching this book, I was constantly surprised by how different reading was from one person to the next as a result of these various neurological conditions. So I didn't even know what all these conditions were when I started this research project. So I think dyslexia is the condition your audience will be most familiar with, but there were conditions like hyperlexia, which will probably be much less known. That's where precocious readers, so young children often as young as 3 or 4, can read an entire novel fluently, or it might even memorize the entire book, but they don't know what the words mean. So it's very different from what we think of ordinarily as reading. Or synesthesia was one of those conditions that stood out to me as well. This is where you might read black and white or black letters on a white page. That's how I see most novels. But if you have synesthesia, you might see an array of colors superimposed on top of these black letters. So it'd be a whole different experience than someone else might be having. So synesthesia usually just means one sense triggering another. So people might hear a symphony, for instance. When I hear a symphony, I get pleasure from the various sounds I hear. But if you have synesthesia, you might be seeing colors in your mind while you're listening to that symphony as well. So it's the same with books for some people. The famous novelist Vladimir Nabokov, he had synesthesia, and he described seeing the letter A in the color of weathered wood. So he didn't even just say, plain wood. It was weathered wood, a very specific texture for him. And there are a whole range of senses that are affected by synesthesia. So the word jail for some readers might actually give you the sensation of having a piece of bacon in your mouth. For some readers, that would be pleasurable. For some readers, that would be disgusting. But a very different experience of reading from the norm. And whereas most of the types of reading I'm looking at are often thought of it as a disability, synesthesia just seems to be a superpower in many ways. I mean, I'm envious of people who are seeing all these colors while reading. But I say that only half seriously because I've read so many testimonies that make it clear that reading isn't just some mechanical skill like some other bodily activities, but affects people's identity at a very profound level. This came out in stories about alexia that I read. So alexia is a condition where people have a stroke or a head injury and lose the ability to read. They might have been reading their entire life and then suddenly overnight lose that ability. I mean, I always thought reading was something you gained in childhood and then it never left you. But you can lose reading if something happens to your brain. This came out very vividly in the case of a Canadian novelist named Howard Engel. He wrote detective books for a living until he had a stroke in the year 2001 and then lost the ability to read. So this would be a tragedy for most people, but certainly if you're an author and your whole living is based on books and writing and reading. He didn't give up, though. He didn't just stop there and say, I guess I can't read anymore. He worked doggedly to regain the ability to read. He was the case I mentioned earlier of reading with his tongue. He could trace letter shapes on, let's say, the palm of his hand that he couldn't recognize visually anymore. He would just look at a newspaper and just see a foreign language there, even though it was a language he'd been reading all his life. But he could trace letter shapes manually, either with his fingers or his tongue, and that would enable him to read, but very, very slowly. This did not stop him, though, from continuing his writing career. He went on to write a terrific memoir titled The Man Who Forgot How to Read, describing very vividly what that experience was like. And he even went on to write novels, again, including one featuring a detective who loses the ability to read and has to be very creative to find ways to solve crimes.
Professor, the idea of atypical readers is central to the book. Who exactly are atypical readers, and why have they been largely left out of the mainstream history of reading?
Yes, so by atypical readers, I mean anyone whose experience of reading is shaped by neurological conditions of various kinds. So dyslexia, hyperlexia, alexia, but also hallucinations or dementia, some experiences that aren't usually linked in with reading disabilities. The philosopher Gillian Rose has a terrific quote. She says, reading was never just reading. She grew up with dyslexia, and I think that quote sort of speaks for a lot of people with a similar condition. Some people, once they learn to read, barely think about it again. But for other people, that is a very fraught activity. And a lot of the cases I'm looking at here of atypical readers are attempts to give people a chance to tell their side of the story. I mean, to sort of share their experiences. Historians have, covered the history of reading quite extensively, but they tend to look at diversity in a kind of narrow way. I mean, they talk about things like class and gender and race and nationality. Those are all important forms of difference, but they still talk about all those readers as if they have the same mental processes in each case. And I've tried to go back to the historical record and find examples where that is not the case. That is not easy to do because it's very difficult to get in the heads of readers from the past. But I think we do have lots of evidence if you look broadly enough for it. So let me just give you one vivid example of an atypical reader, and that's a man named Kim Peek. Kim Peek was a savant who could read 2 pages of a book at the same time. He would read one page with his left eye and then simultaneously read the right page with his right eye. It didn't matter whether those pages were sideways or upside down or reflected in a mirror, he could read them just as quickly. He could also read extremely fast. So he could read Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October, which, it's just a huge doorstopper of a novel. He could read that in under 2 hours, and then he remembered everything he read as well. So I think by the end of his life, he had memorized over 10,000 novels. Some people will be familiar with Kim Peek through the film Rain Man. This was a film that came out in 1988. It starred Tom Cruise, who has in the film an autistic brother played by Dustin Hoffman. And that film does a great job at showing the autistic savant's strengths. So anyone who's seen that film will remember Tom Cruise takes his brother to Las Vegas to use his savant abilities to count in order to make a fortune playing poker. But the film also shows the just the everyday activities that this character needs help with. So even though he's a genius in some respects, he still needed help showering or brushing his teeth and just doing other everyday activities. I think we have a much better understanding of people like this nowadays. A lot of us will be familiar with the term neurodiversity, just to take into account people who see the world differently, behave differently, interact with the world differently. And we recognize both the strengths they have and in many cases the disadvantages they face as well.
Professor, you argue that reading is a spectrum rather than a single activity. Can you walk us through what that spectrum look like from one end to the other?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Whereas the term reading is often taken to be a straightforward activity, as I've mentioned, I see it as an umbrella term covering a whole range of different activities, some of which have very little in common with one another. So a restrictive definition of reading would just break it down into its component parts. So let's say decoding graphic symbols on a page and converting them back into language, and then comprehension, understanding what those symbols or words on a page mean. But there are lots of different ways of reading that only partially fit that definition. So I think we should conceive of reading as a spectrum that covers the full range of ways in which people interact with books. So instead of focusing on trying to draw a line separating readers from non-readers, trying to find where is that boundary, I prefer using the term spectrum. At one end of that spectrum, you will have people who decode words on the page effortlessly, and almost without thinking about it. But at the other end, you might have, let's say, dyslexic readers who have to work very, very hard to decode words on a page, or hyperlexic readers I mentioned who are decoding but struggling to comprehend what they're reading, or synesthetes who just have all sorts of other sensations being mixed in there as well. What I want people to take away from this definition, though, is that these other ways of reading are not failures of reading. They're not wrong ways of reading or non-reading even. They're just variations in how people do it. So I'm trying to make a more inclusive a definition that enables us to have a more inclusive understanding of the term reading, to include all these different ways of doing it that I think historically have just been ignored or omitted from our understanding of reading.
Professor, you draw on sources as diverse as literature, film, medical case studies, and social media. How did you decide which voices and stories deserve a place in this history?
Well, one of the guiding principles for historians who write about the history of disability is that you should try to let disabled people speak for themselves instead of having their stories told for them, as for most of their life, they'll be used to people speaking for them. So there's a slogan among activists that says, "Nothing about us without us." And that's kind of my approach here, is that I wanted to track down the voices of people with reading differences wherever I could find them, since these voices have historically been left out of official sources. So this meant I did have to be quite resourceful or creative in finding these voices. I did be very open-minded about what would count as a source. So I turned to literature or film or in social media and things like that. I thought these sources had huge advantages though as well, because they often went beyond, let's say, official sources, which can be quite impersonal. And they would often convey the lived experience of having these various reading disabilities or these different cognitive conditions. And they really gave a vivid sense of what it was like to live with these conditions. So one source, just to give people an example of what I was working with, I really liked the film titled Temple Grandin. This is based on a memoir written by the autistic activist Temple Grandin. She's one of the most famous autistic people in the world, has been a great spokesperson for the condition, really transformed the way people think about autism. When this film came out in 2010, it was played by the actress, Temple Grandin's role was played by the actress Claire Danes. And there's a great scene showing Temple Grandin reading, where she just glances at the page of a book and basically takes a snapshot of it in her mind. And then the film sort of shows this page, the words on the page overlaying her face, to give you a sense of how Temple would see the page in her mind when she was asked to read it. Her teacher was suspicious that she had read it because it looked like she just glanced on it, wasn't paying attention. But she had that snapshot in her mind so she could just read the words directly from that mental image. And again, this sort of shows that instead of thinking about reading differences in terms of weaknesses, I mean, this is, again, a superpower. I wish I had a photographic memory like Temple Grandin does. But I think the media, like film or literature, can sometimes bring out that experience even more clearly than a factual account preserved in the historical record.
The dyslexia is perhaps the most widely recognized reading difference. Does the popular understanding of dyslexia do justice to the complexity you uncovered in your research?
Yeah, not at all. I think most people still treat dyslexia as if it's just kind of a single condition, making it difficult for people to read. But it's just much more diverse and complex than most people realize, and it just varies tremendously from one person to the next. Um, I should say, I mean, attitudes have changed radically in the last couple of decades, but there's just still a lot of lag, I find, and a lot of people are still behind in having an up-to-date view of what dyslexia consists of. I learned this just by reading, hundreds of memoirs written by people with dyslexia. This might seem like an odd thing to do, since the people with dyslexia that are often writing these books tend to hate books. I mean, they've had terrible experiences with books in school and being teased by peers, and yet they go on to write their life stories. So in some ways, this makes sense. I mean, it shows how seriously they take reading. Again, they don't just view it as a mechanical skill. I mean, something like not being able to ride a bike. They see it as something that is tied in profoundly to their sense of who they are. Um, and they want to, this gives them a chance to sort of, well, one, prove the doubters wrong. People always said, you can't do this. I mean, they're showing that they can. And it also gives them a chance to describe very complex feelings about growing up at a time when dyslexia was poorly understood, and that they were made to feel quite intense feelings of shame that are still with them in many cases. A lot of these accounts, tell school stories about deliberately being disruptive in school because they would rather be perceived as being like a problem child than to be labeled as stupid. So a lot of behavioral issues can sort of be traced back to the complexity of this condition. And a lot of people spend their entire lives trying to pass as someone who doesn't have this invisible disability. But you can imagine how stressful it would be every moment to sort of have to have your guard up in case someone asks you to read, and you might at any moment be outed as someone who is unable to read fluently. So I have a lot of sympathy for the people who write these memoirs. And I guess what I want people to take away from, the work I've done on dyslexia and a lot of the good research I've built on is that dyslexia shouldn't be understood solely through the deficit model. We shouldn't just focus on what people with dyslexia can't do, because often they have tremendous strengths as well. In many cases, people with dyslexia will be excellent at pattern recognition, or they might have creative approaches to problem solving. So I think we should look at the full range of strengths as well as uh, uh, challenges they face. And again, that's why I use the phrase reading differences rather than reading disabilities. I want to focus on the strengths or advantages of these conditions and not just on the deficits.
Professor, dementia and hallucinations are not conditions we typically associate with reading. Do they? So how do they fit into your broader argument about reading differences?
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting cases. I'd say that both of these conditions remind us that reading is about a lot more than simply deciphering the words on the page. Hallucinations are interesting because, a person might be reading perfectly fine. The problem is that the words don't actually exist outside of their minds. In the case of a paranoid schizophrenic reader, they might be reading a novel correctly. They just will be interpreting the words on the page in a very unusual way, as if the novel is transmitting messages to them that other people won't be aware of. So in some ways, they are good readers, but there are all sorts of problems in those cases as well. I find cases of dementia to be extremely moving because these are often instances of people who have been reading their entire life and keep trying to read long after they've have kind of lost the ability to do it. So if you lose your memory, it makes it very tough to read, let's say, long form narratives like a novel because you don't really remember what happened in the beginning, and the end is not going to make sense if you can't kind of remember the plot as you go. Um, but these people are just reading in a different way. So again, I go back to just this phrase, reading differences, because these people are still finding pleasure in reading. They might just be tracing letters with a finger, or they might be looking at the pictures because they evoke memories that are pleasurable for them, or they might simply just find it comforting to have books near them. So there's still something from this reading experience that they're getting something from that, even though it's not kind of what the rest of us consider reading. So again, I just want us to think about cases like this less in terms of trying to draw a line between reading and non-reading. I see these people as adapting to their new capabilities as they age and finding ways to read differently in order to maintain contact with books that they might otherwise lose.
Professor, the book itself is designed to read in any order. What were you trying to communicate to the reader through the structural choice?
That's really my humorous way of using the form of the book to try and reinforce my argument. Um, I'm trying to make the point that there's no single correct way to read. So it seems like it would have been hypocritical of me to then insist that there's only one correct way to read the book. So I'm really just trying to say there that there will be no shaming anyone for reading the book in an idiosyncratic way. And much of the book is saying that you can't take any single aspect of reading for granted. So choose, whatever feature of reading that you think is essential, and I will show you an example of someone who does it in a completely different way. Um, if you're one of those readers who likes to read a book from back to front instead of the other way around, then you're welcome to read my book in that direction.
Professor, what do you hope this book changes in education, in how we design books, or in how society talks about learning differences?
My main goal is to just encourage people to be less concerned with policing the boundaries of what counts as reading. And I want them to be more interested in understanding just the remarkable variety of ways in which people engage with books or interact with them. So ultimately, this is a book about inclusion, trying to expand our conception of reading to fit all those people who do it in unusual ways. I think there are lots of benefits to this. So you mentioned education and publishing. In education, I would hope it would help educators to recognize that there are multiple different pathways to literacy, and we don't need to expect students to all sort of follow the same path. Or in publishing, I would want this research to encourage publishers to continue to embrace accessible formats and make it possible for as many people as as possible to read those books. And finally, I think just understanding other people's ways of reading can be really useful and illuminating about your own way of reading and help you understand your own way of reading much better. Certainly, that was the case for me. Is that I might not have that much in common with, let's say, an autistic reader who is chewing on the pages of books. But it does make me think about all the sensory aspects of reading that I like. I mean, I do find pleasure in touching the page or feeling the ink and maybe even sniffing the book on occasion. So it helped me become more aware of just that sensory aspects of the books that I was aware of, but I think might have downplayed in my reading experience. So it also might just help people realize that maybe their own reading isn't as typical as they think. I mean, the more cases I looked at and the more people I spoke to, the more I came to just the conclusion that we're all basically atypical readers.
Professor Matthew, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You propose that whatever someone does with a book, however unconventional, should still be called reading. Where do you draw the line, if at all?
Well, I don't want to sound too radical, but I am deliberately reluctant to draw a line because I just think we've done enough of that. I want less policing of that boundary. The point I'm making is that every time we try to draw lines, someone comes along whose experience doesn't fit that category. So rather than beginning with a definition of reading and then excluding all the exceptions or edge cases, I begin with the edge cases and then ask what can we learn from them about the concept of reading itself. This doesn't mean that every interaction with a book is identical. Certainly, there are differences between, let's say, reading a book with your eyes or listening to it with your ears, or maybe reading it with your fingers as Braille readers do. There might even be good reasons for this. I mean, when I talk to my children's teacher at school, I have a very narrow definition of reading because I want to know, are they capable of deciphering words on the page and comprehending those words? But in everyday life, if someone comes up to you and says, have you read the novel Gone Girl? What they want to know is, have you read the plot? Can we talk about this sensational plot twist? They're not really asking whether you decoded the words on the page with your eyeballs or listened to it with your ears or read it with your fingers. So we can just use that term in lots of different ways. And I think our understanding of reading and the history of reading becomes much richer if we sort of pay attention to all those diverse ways in which people do it. And I'd like to keep those boundaries just as broad as possible because people read in surprising ways. And as I've been suggesting, I think we have a lot to learn from them.
Professor Matthew Rubery, thank you so much for this truly eye-opening conversation. Reader's Block reminds us that reading is not a single act, but a deeply human and wonderfully diverse experience. And you have given us a new lens through which to see it. To our listeners, if today's conversation sparked something in you, do pick up a copy of Reader's Block, however you choose to read it. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep exploring. Thank you so much, Professor Matthew Rubery, for generously sharing your time, insight with us today. It has been a truly privilege to welcome you and having you on Business Talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.